Some say that Protestants ripped books out of the scriptures, but is this story true, or is there more to it? In this video, we will dive into the history of the formation of the biblical canon to discover what Christians in the first centuries really thought about the books of the Old Testament. Instead of modern opinions, we will analyze testimonies from church fathers, traditions from the East and West, and ancient documents to understand the facts of this controversial history. It all begins with a strong phrase, almost a slogan repeated for centuries. Protestants removed books from the Bible. Stated like this, it sounds simple, direct, and even scandalous, as if someone had taken scissors and cut the pages. However, the real story is much less cinematic and much more like a long academic debate spanning generations. In the first centuries of Christianity, there was no single, closed, and universal list of biblical books, especially in the Old Testament. Different communities used different collections, often influenced by language, location, and Jewish or Greek tradition. Ancient authors, such as Eusebius of Caesarea, record these divergences without treating the subject as resolved. In other words, before any removal, there was already discussion, doubt, and ongoing dialogue. To understand this better, imagine a library under construction, where some books are already clearly on the main shelf, and others are still circulating among reading tables. This is more or less how the biblical canon was formed, gradually, through public debates and theological criteria. The central question was not who took what, but which writings truly carry apostolic authority. This distinction appears in ancient lists, sermons, and pastoral letters spread throughout the Christian world. Until the 4th century, speaking of a closed canon for everyone would be a stretch, plain and simple. This background completely changes the tone of the modern accusation. What if I told you that the Catholic side itself recognizes that the official list of the Bible took centuries to be completed? Respected encyclopedias, such as the Catholic Encyclopedia, explain that the canon was only dogmatically defined at the Council of Trent in the 16th century, in direct response to the Protestant Reformation. Before that, throughout the Middle Ages, there were different opinions within the Church itself, regarding books like Tobit, Judith, and 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Major theologians, such as Cardinal Cajetan in the 16th century, still treated these writings with caution. This shows that the idea of a fixed and indisputable list from the beginning does not match historical records. In practice, it was like having house rules that everyone follows more or less, but which are only written down and hung on the wall much later when a major discussion arises. The Council of Trent, held between 1545 and 1563, marked this moment of official definition. Historians like Hubert Jedden and reference works on church history make this very clear. The question changes. It is no longer why did the Protestants take them out, but why was it only then decided once and for all what went in? And it is at this point that a name emerges that will shake this whole story. Jerome. Imagine a scholar surrounded by parchments, dictionaries, and ancient languages, staying up all night to understand every word. That was Jerome at the end of the 4th century. Sent to Bethlehem, he decided to translate the Old Testament directly from Hebrew, a bold move for the time when many used only the Greek version called the Septuagint. In his prefaces, such as the famous Prologus Galeatus, he is clear in saying that only the books found in the Jewish canon should be considered canonical. Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, and the Maccabees, according to him, served for edification, but not for establishing doctrine. These words are recorded in his own letters and prologues, preserved in patristic collections. For Jerome, the rule was simple. If the Jewish people kept those books in Hebrew, they were the ones that formed the basis of the scriptures inherited by Christians. This set corresponded to the 22 Jewish books, which today are equivalent to the 39 of the Protestant Old Testament, only changing the way of counting. Even facing criticism from friends like Augustine, he maintained his position throughout his life. Historians like F. Bruce and J.N.D. Kelly confirm this firm stance in their works. In other words, the idea of a shorter canon was already there, long before the Reformation. And like every good story, now comes the twist. Did Jerome go back on his word? That is what we will uncover next. From time to time, someone pulls a quote from Jerome as if it were the final card in the game. He submitted to the judgment of the church. But when we go to the source, the story changes. This phrase appears in a letter about which Greek version of Daniel should be used in public reading, whether the Septuagint or Theodotion's. Jerome says he follows the custom of the church to avoid confusion among the faithful, not that he changed his mind about which books were canonical. This detail is in his own letters, gathered in Migna's Patrologia Latina, a classic collection of ancient texts. In other words, they mixed a liturgical debate with the definition of the canon, and from there, the myth was born. The most curious thing is that after this, Jerome continues writing in the same way as always, warning that these ecclesiastical books should not be the basis for doctrine. In his commentaries on Isaiah and Ezekiel, he repeats this distinction bluntly. Modern researchers such as Lee MacDonald in the Biblical Canon highlight this consistency throughout his life. This shows how a quote out of context can take flight and span centuries. And when we realize this, it becomes clear that Jerome was not alone in this view, as we will see shortly by crossing other voices from the Christian West. In the Christian West, other church fathers also made a similar distinction, almost like someone separating study books from light reading. Rufinus of Aquileia, around the year 400, lists the canonical books, and immediately after mentions others that the church reads for the edification of the people, but not to confirm doctrines. Hilary of Poitiers and even Ambrose of Milan follow a similar line in their writings and sermons. These lists appear in works preserved by historians and patristic collections, such as those of Eusebius and Jerome. It was not total rejection, but a kind of two levels of authority. Something much more nuanced than a simple yes or no. In practice, it was like using a storybook to inspire children, but turning to the manual when it comes to house rules. The Deuterocanonical books circulated, they were read in churches, but they did not have the same weight for defining faith and practice. Historian J.N.D. Kelly explains this in Early Christian Doctrines, showing that this distinction was common in the West. This scenario helps to understand why centuries later, no one found it strange to speak of a shorter canon. The tradition had already been built this way, gradually, without fanfare. But if there was this conversation in the West, in the East, the story gains new accents and heavyweight names. While Rome and North Africa debated, in the Christian East, the conversation was also boiling, but with lists very similar to Jerome's. Cyril of Jerusalem, in his Catecheses from the 4th century, instructs the faithful to read only the books recognized by the Jews, leaving out most of the Deuterocanonicals. Athanasius of Alexandria, in the famous Festal Letter number 39, written in the year 367, presents a list that matches the 39 books of the Protestant Old Testament. Gregory of Nazianzus does the same in his didactic poems, listing the books like someone teaching a song so as not to forget. Even the Synod of Laodicea in the 4th century brings a similar list in its canons. Sources preserved by Eusebius and cited by modern scholars confirm these data. Of course, there were small variations, such as the inclusion of Baruch along with Jeremiah in some lists. But the core remained the same. The common point was the reliance on the Hebrew canon as the primary reference. For many in the East, these books better reflected the scriptures used by Jesus and the apostles, something highlighted by authors like Bruce Metzger in the Canon of the New Testament. This shows that the idea of a shorter Old Testament was not an exception, but widespread. When we put these voices together, the picture becomes increasingly clear, and we can still go further back in time, very close to the era of the apostles, where even older testimonies emerge that will illuminate this trail. If we pull the thread even further back, to the 2nd century, we find Melito of Sardis doing something very curious, traveling to Palestine to find out firsthand which books the Jews considered sacred. The account of this list appears in Eusebius of Caesarea's Ecclesiastical History and matches almost entirely with the Hebrew canon, without Tobit, Judith, or Maccabees. Shortly after, Origen, one of the greatest Christian scholars of the 3rd century, also clearly distinguishes the Hebrew books from the others in commentaries preserved by Eusebius. He even lists the 22 Jewish books and notes that other writings are used in churches but not recognized by the Jews. These records are cited by researchers like Lee MacDonald and Bruce Metzger. In other words, this tradition was not born in the Middle Ages, but sprouted very close to the roots of the Christian faith. It is like following ancient footprints in the sand. The further back we walk, the more we realize they point in the same direction. Melito, Origen, and even ancient lists attributed to manuscripts like the so-called Bryennios list show that the debate was already alive early on. It was not stubbornness or a power struggle, but a search for faithfulness to the scriptures inherited from Judaism. This helps to understand why, centuries later, some Christians felt comfortable defending a shorter canon. The story, then, is not one of a late cut, but of parallel paths that followed side by side for a long time. And when these paths cross again, in the whirlwind of the Reformation, the final scenario begins to take shape. We arrive then at the 16th century, with Europe in turmoil and names like Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli questioning everything from faith to politics. When the Reformers adopt the Old Testament with 39 books, they do not say they are creating something new, but following the trail of Jerome and the Eastern lists. On the other side, the Catholic Church reaffirms, at the Council of Trent between 1545 and 1563, the broader canon, echoing the tradition of Augustine and the local councils of Hippo and Carthage at the end of the 4th century. These African councils, it is worth remembering, never had universal weight but greatly influenced the Latin West. Historians like Hubert Jedden and Bruce Metzger explain this context in detail. Thus, two ancient heritages meet in a moment of rupture. Seen from afar, it does not look like someone ripping pages out of a book, but heirs choosing which shelf of the old library to follow. Each side appeals to traditions that had already existed for over 1,000 years. Therefore, many scholars prefer to say that there was a selection between ancient canons, rather than a late and arbitrary removal. This difference shaped translations, sermons, doctrines, and even the way millions of people read the Bible today. In the end, the question changes its clothes. It is not who took it out, but which tradition best reflects the origins. And when the dust settles, we are left with the challenge of looking at this story with fewer labels and more care. Now, take a deep breath, because it is time to tie all this together and think about what this journey says for our time. At the end of this journey, one can perceive that the question, who took books out of the Bible, might be too simple for such a long and winding story. What we see, in reality, are ancient communities trying to be faithful to the scriptures they received, like someone passing on an inheritance with all care, even while disagreeing on which pieces are the most valuable. This impacts faith, culture, education, and the way millions of people read and trust the Bible to this day, whether in a service, a mass, or that quiet moment before sleep. The story is not one of villains with scissors, but of traditions that walked different paths throughout the centuries.